What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel. And for those of you who may have forgotten about this, I was intending on doing one last album ranking for a band before the end of the year, but I was struggling for a little bit to determine which band I wanted to do the final album discography ranking for in 2021. But then the more I thought about it and realized with the date today, December 13th, I thought to myself, you know what? December 13th, 20 years ago, was the day that unfortunately we lost one of the biggest metal legends of all time, the one and the only godfather of death metal, Chuck Schuldiner from Death, Control Denied, among a few other projects he was a part of or formed. And like I said, 20 years since we lost him due to cancer, and he's been dearly missed to this very day by many of his friends and musicians that were influenced by him, and I can't even put to words how much we all miss Chuck. And I feel like if he was still alive today, I feel like he would be very, very proud of the musical influence that he has laid out now. Granted, there was a period in the 90s where he did not want to have anything to do with death metal. I feel like given how people are flattered by compliments nowadays in terms of music, I think he would look past that and realize, you know what? I've helped create a heavy monster of a genre out there in heavy metal, and people are taking my music, making it their own, and putting so many twists and turns on it. Everything from brutal death to mellow death, tech death, prog death, death doom. Basically anything death metal, you will hear traces of the band Death. That's just the way it goes, and that's the way it should go. So, I figured with, the 20th anniversary of his unfortunate passing, I thought, why not rank all 7 Death studio albums and give the history, so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's get started. So, the history about the band Death. Well, we're going to get started all the way back to 1983 out of Altamont Springs, Florida, which was like in between Orlando and Tampa, basically the Florida metal scene as a whole. And the band was started by a couple of kids that were just into metal and just wanted to go full bore with creating something of their own. And those 2 kids, or actually 3 kids, were Cam Lee, Rick Ross, and Chuck Schuldiner. This lineup was Cam Lee on drums and vocals, Rick Ross on bass, I believe? No, he was on guitar, and Chuck on guitar as well. So yeah, in the origins of the band Mantis, which was the original name of the band, yeah, Cam Lee was the one doing vocals in the very beginning, at least at the time. So, that was the early lineup of Death before, well, Mantis at the time. Then in 1984, they decided to change their name. After releasing the Death by Metal demo, the band decided to change the name to Death and basically called themselves Florida's original death metal band. So, after the initial lineup, some changes would come about. We would see members like Eric Mead come in on bass. We would have Eric Breach, formerly of DRI and Hyrax, coming in on drums at one point. And hell, even an interesting lineup that I was shocked that they didn't do a demo with this lineup. Chuck then moved to vocals and guitar. Cam Lee stuck it out on drums. But then you would see 2 members of Repulsion, well, at the time known as Genocide, Scott Carlson on bass and Matt Olivo on guitar. Imagine if that lineup would have stuck for at least a demo. It could have been something special. But alas, that lineup didn't work out as Matt and Scott moved back up to Flint, Michigan to get Genocide or Repulsion going again. So, after a while, Chuck was just kind of left on his own because Cam Lee would then go on to be a part of Massacre at the time. So Chuck thought, well, I'm kind of by myself. What am I going to do? So he, at one point, was in the Canadian death thrash band Slaughter, but then he moved back home to the States and eventually settled out in the Bay Area scene, the Bay Area thrash scene that was going very strong in the mid-'80s. And he met a young drummer named Chris Ryford. And them two would hook up together and start jamming tunes together and writing songs, while at the same time becoming best friends with the band Sadus, like Steve DiGiorgio, John Allen, all the guys from Sadus, and they would come together to play at each other's practice rooms all the time. And so, after recording demos between Chuck and Chris, and it was just them two, they couldn't find other band members, so Chuck did guitars, bass, and vocals, while Chris did the drums. Because of the success of those demos, they eventually got signed to Combat Records, which was a pretty big underground metal label during the 80s. That was signing up bands like Possessed and Exodus, early on Megadeth, so many others. So Death goes to Combat Records. Then they get to record their debut album. First they recorded it in Florida, but the engineer did not know what he was doing with the songs, and Combat rejected that first session and sent them to LA to record with Randy Burns. And finally, in 1987, we get the debut album from Death, Scream Bloody Gore. So, Scream Bloody Gore, this album for me is my number 4 album. Now, let me preface, every single one of these albums, in my opinion, are 10 out of 10. So, ranking this is incredibly difficult, because it can change any given day, but for now, Scream Bloody Gore is ranked as my number 4 album. This is a masterpiece of a debut. It's very thrash-oriented, however, but then again, when death metal was starting out with bands like Death and Possessed and Executioner, who later became Obituary, Morbid Angel, it was still very thrash-oriented. It wasn't fully realized until the end of the 80s with another album we're going to talk about later. But Scream Bloody Gore, despite the thrashiness of it, you are hearing what would eventually become death metal. We get some halftime stuff, some mid-tempo stuff, even some doom-laden riffs at times on this album, starting off with this crazy scream in Infernal Death by Chuck, and then just full-on heavy, brutal shit right here. Songs like Zombie Ritual, Sacrificial, Baptized in Blood, one of my all-time favorite Death songs, Evil Dead, the title track, just top to bottom, cut after cut after cut. And this is arguably the most important death metal album of all time. Yeah, some people say Seven Churches by Possessed came first. For me, though, I keep saying it, and I'll always say it, to me, Possessed was more thrash metal than death metal. While here, yeah, it was still thrash-oriented, but you got more elements that would become death metal. The more doomy stuff, the mid-tempo stuff, wasn't all about playing blazingly fast all the time. So basically, Chuck and Death perfected what Possessed did. Like, Possessed started a little bit of something, Death's like, we need to work on what they're doing, but make it better and perfect that kind of style. And from all accounts with Scream Bloody Gore, they did perfect death metal. And it will go down as one of the greatest debut albums of all time, at least in my eyes. So after Scream Bloody Gore, the band itself kind of went into a bit of a crisis because Chuck wanted to go back home to Florida. However, Chris, he was wanting to stay in San Francisco. So the two just split up. Chuck moved back home to Florida, while Chris would eventually form his own band, Autopsy, which, very influential death metal band, Death Doom even. So when Chuck came back to Florida, he hooked back up with Rick Ross, as well as getting together with bassist Terry Butler and drummer Bill Andrews, and all three of them, Rick, Terry, and Bill, already going with Massacre at the time, so they decided, you know what? Let's put Massacre on hold, let's help Chuck out, get Death back underway, especially for a tour that was coming up. And they toured, and eventually this lineup was solidified for the next couple of years. And the following year, 1988, we would get the second album from Death, Leprosy. Now, Leprosy is my number 2 album. Now, as much praise as I gave Scream Bloody Gore, I think Leprosy kind of perfected the really kind of crystallized the sound of what Death is. Basically, kind of moving away from just playing mostly thrash stuff and adding in more groove, a little bit more melody, and more hooks, as well as some more doom-laden stuff. Like, not death doom, but some more doomy, mid-tempo sections in the songwriting. Starting off with the awesome title track, Born Dead is a thrasher of a track. Pull the Plug, probably the most memorable song on here because it's very mid-tempo, doomy with a couple of thrash moments, and also one of the most recognizable choruses in all of Death's discography. Other great songs on here too, like Left to Die, Opened Casket is great, Primitive Ways, just top to bottom. This is really, like, as much as important as Scream Bloody Gore was, I feel like now Leprosy is even more important to the development of death metal than Scream Bloody Gore because it got perfected to its core. It basically created death metal as we know it today. Like Morbid Angel and Obituary, Bolt Thrower, Carcass, Cannibal Corpse, you will hear traces of this album in every death metal album that has been released since. And this was also the first time they recorded at Moorsound Studios when Moorsound was just beginning to get the ball rolling in terms of their production value. And this was one of the first major albums, along with Sabotage and the Hall of the Mountain King, that started to get national recognition and thought, you know, that Moorsound Studios, that might be a good place to go record. Wasn't quite that way until we get to the 90s. But Leprosy, it's a masterpiece, it deserves all the praise it gets, and it's my number 2 Death album. So, also I forgot to mention with Leprosy, the lineup, while it was Chuck, Terry, Rick, and Bill, Terry Butler was a nervous wreck and could not do the bass tracks, so to save time and money, he asked Chuck to do the bass, and Chuck said no problem because he played bass on Scream Bloody Gore, no problem at all. So, almost forgot to mention that little hiccup there. But, aside from all that, the band goes out on tour, and you kind of run into a bit of a theme with death tours. Some would get cut short because of financial issues, or just business behind the scenes not going awry, not going well. In the case of the tour for Leprosy, Death got equal billing with Dark Angel, but Chuck felt that they should have been co-headlining with Dark Angel, which, yeah, you could kind of interpret that in your own way and make your own opinion about it. But aside from all that, so eventually Chuck let Rick Ross go because he wanted to expand the band's horizons and didn't think Rick was that capable of keeping it going that way. So it was for the tour, the remainder of the tour, when they went to Mexico in '89, Paul Masvidal from Cynic would join in on guitars briefly for the live shows, but then as far as studio, they would pick up a hell of a pick, James Murphy, who would later go on to play for bands like Testament, Obituary, Cancer, his own band Disincarnate, among a few others. So with all that said, that's the lineup we get here. Chuck, James, Terry, and Bill, and together, back to Moorsound Studios in 1990, we get the release of Spiritual Healing. Now this was a bit of a shift in not only in the style but in the lyrical content. It was still gory, but it was more real-life horror. Whereas the first two albums, Scream Bloody Gore and Leprosy, it was more horror film, fantasy-based stuff. Here, this was more like real-life horror. And musically, you start to hear where the band would eventually go for the rest of their career, and that's embracing more technical play as well as progressive songwriting. And for those reasons, Spiritual Healing is my number 3 album. I absolutely love this album from top to bottom. Like, every riff, it's catchy. The vocal performance from Chuck, this was maybe my favorite vocal performance from Chuck because you can hear him do the high screams, but his gutturals, I think, were at his best on this album. Granted, in the production, his vocals might be a bit too upfront at times, compared to the instruments, but for the most part, everything was mixed well. Nothing was over top of each other and kind of making it sound except for a couple of moments, especially with the high screams on Low Life. That could be one hiccup, but the songs on here, Living Monstrosity, Altering the Future, Defensive Personalities, like I said, Low Lives, Killing Spree, but the title track, one of my all-time favorite Death songs. I mean, the riffs, it's like this groove-laden death metal track with a couple of like D beats and thrash moments at times, but with some amazing lead work. James and Chuck together doing leads, probably, in my opinion, out of all the guitar duos that Chuck has been a part of in Death, this was the best one. He and James both love their melodic play, both love their classic metal influences, and wanted to showcase that on this album. And I think, from all that counts, they did it to perfection. And Spiritual Healing by number 3. So not too long after Spiritual Healing, however, the band would start touring again. However, Chuck and James started to butt heads a little bit, and James was kicked out of the band. And then they eventually, Bill and Terry realized Chuck did not want to go to Europe because of personal issues that Chuck was having at the time. But Terry and Bill just saw, well, other tours were canceled. We got contracts we need to fulfill, so they pick up a couple of their crewmates that played instruments and did vocals to jump on board with Terry and Bill to go to Europe to tour, opening up for Creator. However, Chuck was very upset about it, but then after a bit, he wanted to go over there to be a part of the tour, but he wasn't allowed to go over there because Creator didn't want him over there, and contractually, 2/3 of the band is over there. So Terry and Bill realized at that moment, yeah, we're not in the band anymore, we're just fulfilling this contractual stuff. So Chuck had to start from scratch in terms of the lineup once again, and what a lineup he would pick up for the next album. He would pick up Paul Masvidal once again to come in on guitars, Sean Reinert, also from Cynic, rest in peace, to come in on drums, and his good old friend Steve DiGiorgio from Sadus to come in to play bass. And together with this lineup, in 1991 would release Human. Another notable shift in the band's style. So we kind of heard hints of what they would eventually become on Spiritual Healing with the proggy and technical playing. Here, they kind of fully realized that style and really went full-bore technical and progressive with the songwriting. And also, lyrically, this would set a new change. Gone were the horror lyrics, and in comes more the enlightenment, philosophical, reality-based lyrics, basically stuff like, what's my purpose in life? Basically, thinker lyrics that gets your mind going. And I'll be honest, I appreciate those lyrics a little bit more than the gory stuff. Even though I love gore lyrics like anybody else, I think Chuck's more thought-provoking lyrics were more powerful and more mature. Yeah, that's the way I'll go with it. Controversy, this one's my number 6 album. I love this album. Again, all these albums are perfect. It's just ranking these was incredibly difficult because I love this band so much. I love Chuck so much. And I love these albums so much. But Human's always been one of those albums that I've had less experience with compared to others. But even though I've listened to this several times, all these songs are just brilliant. Flattening of Emotions, that opening drum intro, and me being a drummer, absolutely love Sean Reinert's performance on this album, even though I will never get to that level of playing drums. Never in my life. I'd have to, quit my job, move into somebody who has money, and just practice all day, and then see what happens. But that will never happen. But yeah, Flattening of Emotions, an amazing opener. Suicide Machine is a phenomenal song. Lack of Comprehension, which got them their first music video on MTV. Other songs like Cosmic Sea. I know Necrotic Nick does not like Cosmic Sea. I love Cosmic Sea. It's one of the best instrumentals I have ever heard. Not my favorite Death instrumental. That will come much later. But I mean, just top to bottom. Vacant Planets, fucking amazing song. Just top to bottom. And this is the shortest Death album, too. Like, I think it's like about 35 minutes, roughly. And wow, does the album pack a punch. And the technical playing at times, but the progressive songwriting is right up my alley. And the solos, beautiful and melodic. I mean, what more can I say about this album that hasn't been said already? It's definitely one of the best death metal albums of all time, but it's my number 6 in terms of death albums from top to bottom. But that's just me. So after Death Human was released, the band decided, you know what, let's finally make this European tour happen and get rid of all the reputation that Chuck has, quote unquote, about being unreliable with tours. So they went over to Europe and had a successful tour in terms of the shows. However, the financial backside, or the financial side of things, did not go very well, especially with them flying equipment over from the States to England instead of just renting stuff. That caused some money issues. And also the bus they were in, there were guys that were working with them that smoked, and they all got sick, and they decided we need to cancel this tour because it's just gotten out of control. We're losing money, we're getting sick. No point in keeping this going anymore. So, yeah. After that tour happened, Chuck came back home and started with a new lineup once again. Paul and Sean basically, well, Chuck basically kind of felt, you know what, Paul and Sean, I thank you guys for helping me out, but I'll let you guys do your thing with Cynic, and I'll find some new guys to keep my sound going forward, because after all, Chuck respected Cynic for what they did and didn't want to have them held hostage from Cynic, so he's like, I'll let them go, they can do their own thing, I'm going to do my own thing. Steve DiGiorgio sticks around for this album. We get, for a drummer, how about one of the greatest drummers in metal history, Gene Hoglan from Dark Angel at the time, coming in to be on drums, and then to play lead guitar, we get Andy LaRocque from King Diamond to come in on second guitar for this next album, and in 1993, once again recorded at Moore Sound Studios, once again recorded with Scott Burns, we get Individual Thought Patterns. For a long time, this was near the top of my list, but in recent years, it fell a little bit. It's my number 5. Still absolutely love this album. I think this is one of the Death albums I've listened to the absolute most, and this definitely represented another change in style. Gone was most of the technical play. I mean, there are some technical moments at times, but this is more straightforward, progressive death metal. And that's basically the sound we would get going forward to the end of the career. More straightforward, progressive death metal with some hints of what would eventually be christened as melodic death metal, because there's a lot of melodic play going on this album in the solos. Maybe not as much in the riffs, but in the solos, even more melodic, more beautiful. Songs like Overactive Imaginations, Jealousy, Inhuman Form, the title track, Mentally Blind. But my favorite songs on the album, the final 3, Destiny, Out of Touch, and their second music video, The Philosopher. I mean, those 3 songs just capture so much emotion, so much thought, and the playing among all 4 of them, Chuck, Andy, Steve, and Gene, oh my god, like, talk about a musical orgasm moment. This album is just full of those moments, and I can't even put to words. I can't even put the words. I remembered listening to this album almost nonstop in high school, and it just... I might as well just shut up and move on before I just go into silence for the next 5 minutes because of just how amazing this album is. But after they did some festival dates over in Germany for the Full of Hate Festival with other bands such as Gorefest, Carcass, and Cannibal Corpse, talk about a hell of a festival lineup right there with those 4 bands. And also Tiamat as well. How could I forget Tiamat? Um, Andy decided, you know what, I'm going to go back home to do King Diamond. After all, he was only asked to do solos on the album, not to join the band full time. Meanwhile, Steve couldn't make it back in time for the recording of the next album, even though he started the writing process. Gene Hoglan stuck around. So who do we get on bass and second guitar for the next one? Well, we get Kelly Conlon from formerly of Monstrosity and Vital Remains to come in on bass, and Bobby Cobley, who was like a local guitarist of the Florida scene, to come in on second guitar, and together, and now on a new label on Roadrunner Records, and this would be the only album released on Roadrunner. In 1995, we get Symbolic. This is my number 1 album. I figured it would be because I feel like in terms of everything Death is about, brutality, melody, beauty, technicality, memorable hooks, songwriting, guitar solos, just everything that makes Death the band that they are or was, I think Symbolic is the perfect representation of Death's entire career. After all, and also vocally, Chuck changed his vocal style a little bit. Gone were the more lower guttural vocals, and comes to more high screaming vocals. And songwriting wise, a lot more melodic, more proggy, and even some hints of power metal can be heard on here as well, and also some thrash thrown into the mix as well. Then again, thrash has always been kind of an ingredient in Death's songwriting in terms of intensity and adding speed. But, I mean, these songs are just absolutely incredible. The title track, Sacred Serenity, with one of my favorite drum intros, Crystal Mountain, maybe my favorite Death song of all time. If not, it's up there. Other songs like 1,000 Eyes, Without Judgment, Empty Words. Good Lord. The Perennial Quest, just... there's just so many great songs on this album. Zero Tolerance, how could I forget Zero Tolerance? Misanthrope, I mean, all 9 of these songs, they're just beautifully crafted. And again, it's hard to put into words how great these songs are. God, I just miss Chuck so much. I really, really do. But after the album came out, we get into a bit of a heated moment where the band is touring with Benediction. And this was around the time when Roadrunner, they were still going in terms of signing death metal bands, did this thing for a magazine where he had Symbolic and Deicide's Once Upon the Cross, Suffocation's Breeding the Spawn, and like a promotional thing, and Chuck was upset about that. And during one gig where Chuck just sat in the bus while Gene, Bobby, and Kelly decided to get up on stage with Benediction and play Zombie Ritual, and Chuck thought that that was disrespectful and, quote, "You're conjuring a dick." And that led to, and for all accounts, the band was done after that, because then Chuck decided to hook up with a couple other guys, hook up with Shannon Hamm, Scott Clendenin, and drummer Richard Christie to work on Control Denied, which was a new band that Chuck had formed, which was more of a prog metal band, and even power metal a little bit, because Chuck had always wanted Death to have a melodic vocal, but when they first started, he wanted to be in the death metal style, but this was around the time he wanted to really embrace the progressive metal landscape and embrace his classic metal influences from Iron Maiden and Metallica. So Control Denied was formed with Shannon, Chuck, Scott, and Richard, and it eventually changed over to Steve DiGiorgio coming in to play bass for Control Denied later on. But in terms of the original Control Denied lineup with Chuck, Richard, Shannon, and Scott, as well as new vocalists that would come in, Tim Amar. Originally, some of the songs that were written for the next Death album was supposed to have been Control Denied songs. But then the band signed to Nuclear Blast Records, and they wanted another Death studio album. So we got one last Death studio album in 1998 on Nuclear Blast Records. We get The Sound of Perseverance. While this is my last place, my number 7 album, it's still a phenomenal album, and to me, in terms of final albums, this is one of the best final albums for a band ever, because progressive songwriting 100% confirmed here. There's more technical playing coming back, more melody showing up, and I mean, just top to bottom, definitely the most experimental Death album, because we get into some long song territory here on a few of these tracks, like A Moment of Clarity, Flesh and the Power It Holds. Again, just top to bottom, it's powerful, it's proggy, it's brutal, it's beautiful. Kind of like a precursor to like a lot of progressive death metal and technical death metal bands that kind of followed the path of Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance. Bands like Obscura, Necrophagist, Nile, even Opeth to some degree, Edge of Sanity a little bit as well. I mean, songs like Scavenger of Human Sorrow, Spirit Crusher, one of the band's best songs, Flesh and the Power It Holds, my favorite instrumental, Voice of the Soul, and one of the saddest songs in all of metal, To Forgive is to Suffer, A Moment of Clarity, and then you end it with one of the greatest cover songs of all time, their cover of Judas Priest, Painkiller, and they did it justice, and they did it in their own way. Chuck even doing some clean vocals, and from all accounts, not a bad clean vocalist. I would have been curious to hear what Death would have sounded like with clean vocals, and I think it would have been amazing regardless. So after Sound of Perseverance, the band went out on a big tour, and then in 1999, while they were recording the Control Denied album, Chuck Schuldiner felt a pain in his nerve, thinking it was a pinched nerve, until he went to an acupuncturist and get them, and then, freak out, get an MRI right now, and he finds out he has a brain tumor. And he would go to try to get it treated, but the medical bills were becoming increasingly expensive with every surgery he would go through, to the point where Chuck seemed not capable of being able to pay the bills, because he didn't have a whole lot of money during this period, and other bands and musicians were trying all they could to raise money, not only for Chuck Schuldiner, but also for Chuck Billy, who was also battling, Chuck Billy from Testament, who was also battling cancer, and why we had a tour or a show where he had Testament, Anthrax, SOD, among so many other bands, doing a show to raise money for both the Chucks. But even like other bands and musicians like Kid Rock, Sepultura, Max Cavalera, the Foo Fighters, Fear Factory, even a young Matt Heafy of Trivium, when he was just a teenager, was doing fundraisers to help raise money for Chuck's medical bills that were getting more expensive. Eventually, he got well, then the tumor came back, and it was just downhill from there, and then he got hit with pneumonia, which was caused by complications due to the tumor, and then sometime in 2000, the band got offered to do a show in Italy opening for Metallica, which would have been the biggest show Death had ever done. And Chuck was close to making it happen, but unfortunately, he was just too sick and he couldn't do it. And sadly, on this day, 20 years ago, 2001, December 13th, Chuck Schuldiner passed away about an hour or two after he came back home from the hospital. And MTV covered the funeral, and so many people were there for his funeral. King Diamond, Glenn Benton, Mike Patton, Dave Grohl, among so many other musicians, as well as every former or present member of Death at the time, all attended his funeral. And It was just a sad, sad day. But I don't want to leave this video on a sour or on a somber note. Let's end with a positive note. All 7 of these Death albums represent arguably the greatest metal band of all time to not have a bad album. In my opinion, all 7 of these albums are perfect albums. When you rank them, it's all based on your taste or your experience with these albums, which was kind of the way I based it, based off of my love for each album as well as my experience with each album. But top to bottom, I mean, Death, Chuck Schuldiner leaves behind an incredible legacy that will never ever be duplicated. Many can try and replicate it, but it can never be duplicated. Because without Death, death metal would not exist in the way that we know it now. Morbid Angel, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Deicide, Carcass, Bolt Thrower, Obscura, Goreguts, Decapitated, Nile, Opeth, Entombed, Dismember, Autopsy. I could go on and on and on at the gates. Among so many death metal bands that came after Death and after Possessed, without Death in particular, you would not have death metal music at all. Death and Chuck left behind a legacy that is unmatched, and I deeply love, absolutely love, to this day. Hence why Death is among my top 5 favorite bands in all of music. Not just metal, but in all of music. And for that, Chuck Schuldiner, I salute you. May you rest in peace in a better place, and thank you for the music you have gifted to the entire world. But overall, that does it for my Death album ranking. How would you guys rank the Death discography? If so, let me know in the comments below, or if you want to make a response, let me know the video and I will watch. But until next time, horns high, and I will see you in the next one. I don't want to do this, but I have no other option.
No! Please! Is it what
I feel like I'm about to commit the biggest genocide of all time on this show.
Wait,
my number 7, my number 7, Behemoth the Satanist.
No! 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 No!
And now Hannah's going to hide in the shadows.
Damn you!
Everybody
Why?
dies.
Why?